The paper in Marcella Dugan's hand was shaking, and not because of the wind howling through the cracks in the depot walls. "You lied to me," she said, her voice low and dangerous, the kind of quiet that comes just before something breaks beyond repair. Every single word in that letter was a lie. Bernard Carson stood across the narrow platform, hat in his hands, jaw tight as iron, eyes carrying something she could not yet name. Guilt, yes, but something far more complicated than simple guilt. Behind him, the last train of the evening was pulling away from Dodge City, Kansas, its whistle fading into the purple-gray darkness of the 1876 frontier sky. Marcella had nowhere to go. The money in her bag amounted to $14.30, and the city she had left behind in Missouri was no longer home to anyone who wanted her. "I can explain," Bernard said. "You advertised for a housekeeper," Marcella said, cutting him off. "You described a ranch that was established, prosperous, fully staffed. You said there would be a separate residence for the position. You said the work was manageable for a woman of moderate constitution." Her voice broke on the last word, not from sadness but from fury. "Bernard Carson, I am standing in front of what your ranch hand, your very apologetic ranch hand, described to me as a half-burned homestead, 2 surviving cattle, and no other workers besides a 14-year-old boy who is apparently terrified of horses." Bernard said nothing for a long moment. A muscle worked in his jaw. The lantern swinging from the depot post cast sharp shadows across the angular planes of his face, illuminating the honest tiredness in his 31-year-old eyes. "The fire was 3 weeks before I sent the advertisement," he finally said. "Then why did you still send it?" That was the question that hung between them like smoke, impossible to wave away. Marcella had left Hannibal, Missouri, 6 days ago. She had packed everything she owned into one leather traveling case and a carpet bag. She had said goodbye to a town that had already said goodbye to her long before she boarded the train. A town where her late husband's debts had sold away their home, where his hidden gambling problem had unraveled their marriage before tuberculosis took him entirely, where the whispers of pity and judgment had become more suffocating than grief itself. She had answered Bernard Carson's advertisement in the Missouri Republican newspaper, not because she harbored any romantic notions about the frontier. She had answered it because she needed work, she needed distance, and she needed to stop being the woman that Hannibal felt sorry for. She had expected very little. She had prepared herself for hard conditions. She had told herself on every mile of that lurching train journey that she was walking into difficulty, and that difficulty was something she had learned to carry. She had not prepared herself for betrayal. And yet here she was, standing at the Dodge City Depot on a Thursday evening in late September, the smell of cattle and dust and coal smoke heavy in the air, looking at a man whose letter she had read so many times she had memorized it, and discovering that almost none of it was true. "I needed someone," Bernard said quietly, "and I knew if I wrote the truth, no one would come." The honesty of that statement was so blunt it caught her off guard. He did not dress it up. He did not reach for excuses. He simply said it, and the rawness of it was almost more disarming than an apology would have been. Marcella stared at him. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had pictured from the careful, formal phrasing of his letters, with dark hair that curled slightly behind his ears where he had pushed his hat back too many times in a long day. His coat was clean but worn at the elbows. His boots were good quality and well-maintained, which told her something about what he chose to take care of when resources were limited. She thought about $14.30. She thought about Hannibal. She looked at Bernard Carson, this man who had lied to get her here, and then confessed it to her face within the first 10 minutes of meeting her, and she made the most pragmatic decision of her adult life. "Show me the ranch," she said, his eyebrows lifted just slightly. "You are not leaving." "I cannot leave tonight. That was the last train." She picked up her traveling case with a firmness that closed the subject. "Show me the ranch and we will discuss the terms of an honest arrangement in the morning. And Bernard Carson, if I find one more lie between now and then, I will find a way to leave this frontier that does not involve a train. The ride out to the Broken Spur Ranch took 40 minutes by wagon, and they spent most of it in a silence that was surprisingly not hostile. The Kansas plains spread out around them in the darkness, enormous and breathing under a sky so thick with stars that Marcella, despite everything, could not help tilting her head back to look at them. She had never seen so many stars. The horizon in Missouri always had something competing with the sky: trees, hills, church steeples. Here the sky simply won, vast and unchallenged, and even through her anger and exhaustion she felt something loosen in her chest. "You did not have to hire a housekeeper specifically," she said, breaking the silence. "You could have advertised for any type of help." "I needed someone who understood domestic management," Bernard said. He kept his eyes on the dark road, guiding the two-horse team with the easy competence of someone who had made this drive 10,000 times. "The house needs to function. That is the foundation of everything else. Why not hire locally?" He was quiet for a moment. "People in Dodge City know the full situation with the Broken Spur. They know how bad the fire was. They know what I lost." A pause. "Nobody local wants to bet on a ranch that burned. But a stranger from Missouri might." A stranger from Missouri did not know the odds. "And now she does," Marcella said. "And now she does," he agreed without flinching. The Broken Spur came into view as a cluster of shapes against the dark. A main house that was, to her moderate relief, intact, a barn that showed clear evidence of hasty repair on its east wall, and two structures beyond it that were clearly the burned remains of what had been outbuildings. Even in the dark she could see the pale raw wood of new lumber spliced against older weathered boards. He had been rebuilding. That much was evident. The interior of the house was sparse but clean. A stone fireplace on the west wall, a good solid table with 4 chairs, a wood stove in the kitchen area that was clearly functional, shelves with basic provisions, and a narrow hallway leading to what turned out to be 2 bedrooms and a small room that had been set up as the separate residence the advertisement had promised: small, but genuinely separate, with its own door to the outside and a good lock on it. That detail, the lock, told her something about Bernard Carson too. She slept that night in a real bed with a wool blanket pulled up to her chin, listening to the alien silence of the frontier. And in the morning she woke before dawn because a rooster she had not seen the night before announced his existence with tremendous confidence from somewhere very close to her window. Breakfast was already happening in the kitchen when she emerged. Bernard was at the wood stove, managing a skillet with a focused competence that surprised her, and the 14-year-old boy, whose name turned out to be Eli Rourke, an orphan from Wichita who Bernard had taken on as a general helper 2 months ago, was sitting at the table eating cornbread and looking at Marcella with wide, cautious eyes. "Good morning," Bernard said, not looking up from the skillet. "There is coffee." She found the enamel pot on the stove and poured herself a cup, and it was strong and hot and very good, and she stood there drinking it for a moment before she sat down across from Eli. "You do not like horses?" she asked the boy. Eli's ears went red. "I do not have a problem with horses exactly," he said carefully. "I have a problem with one specific horse, the gray one." "What does the gray one do?" "He has opinions," Eli said. "Strong opinions, mostly about me." Bernard set a plate in front of her: eggs, cornbread, a slice of salt pork, and sat down across from both of them, and they ate together in what was, despite everything, a remarkably normal domestic scene for 3 strangers on a half-rebuilt ranch in the middle of Kansas. "The honest situation," Bernard said, setting down his coffee cup after a while. "I have 240 acres. The fire took the stable, 1 outbuilding, 12 horses, and most of my winter feed supply. I have 15 head of cattle left, not 2. I want to correct Eli's assessment from last night. He miscounted, and I have a breeding pair of draft horses and the gray mare that has opinions. The ranch is functional. It is not prosperous. It will be prosperous again if the next 18 months go well." "What does well look like?" Marcella asked. "A healthy calf crop in spring. Grass that holds through a dry summer. A working arrangement here at the house so I can spend my days on ranch work instead of domestic management. He looked at her directly. And someone I can trust. You lied to get me here, she said, because they were being honest now and that fact needed to stay on the table. I did, he said, and I told you the truth the moment I saw you. I would rather lose you to honesty than keep you through deception. That is the only defense I have. Marcella Dugan thought about the kind of men she had known. She thought about her late husband, Thomas, whose secrets had accumulated like unpaid debts over 7 years of marriage until the weight of them crushed everything else. She thought about what it meant that Bernard had confessed immediately, standing on that platform in the dark, with the train pulling away and the obvious calculation available to him that he could have simply let her discover things gradually and hope she would be too embedded to leave. He had not done that. The pay you advertised, she said. Was that also a lie? No, he said. That I can deliver. $15 a month, meals provided in the room. In 1876, $15 a month plus room and board was a fair wage for a housekeeper in any territory. It was better than fair for the frontier. She could save money. She could rebuild something that resembled a stable future. I will stay through spring, she said. We reassess then. Bernard nodded, and something in his shoulders settled, a tension releasing that she realized had been there since he had first seen her step off that train, angry and betrayed and still, despite everything, carrying her own bags with complete self-possession. The first weeks at the Broken Spur were an education in what it actually meant to live on the frontier. Marcella had grown up in a Missouri River town. She understood hard work in theory and had practiced it in the years of Thomas's illness, when money grew scarce and the domestic management of their household fell entirely on her. But Hannibal had infrastructure. It had a general store, a doctor, neighbors within shouting distance, a church with a women's society, a river with regular steamboat traffic bringing goods from St. Louis. The frontier had dust, wind, vast distances, and the profound understanding that if something needed doing, you were the one who was going to do it. She learned which provisions came from the Dodge City General Store and at what intervals Bernard made the trip. She learned that water came from a well and that the well's rope needed inspection every week because the Kansas wind dried everything faster than she had thought possible. She learned that Eli Rourke was genuinely capable and genuinely trying, and that his issue with the gray mare, whose name, she discovered, was Persimmon, was based in a legitimate incident where the horse had bitten clean through his jacket sleeve. She learned that the gray mare had no such opinions about Marcella, a fact that seemed to genuinely puzzle Eli and that Marcella found quietly amusing. She also learned, gradually and against her better intentions, things about Bernard Carson. He worked from before dawn until after dark, every day, without complaint. She would wake to find him already gone to the barn, and she would sometimes see the lantern still moving in the pasture when she looked out after supper. He ate everything she cooked with sincere appreciation that was not flattery but simply genuine hunger and gratitude. He treated Eli with a patient directness that was neither falsely gentle nor harsh, the way someone treats a young person they genuinely respect without condescending to them. He read. That surprised her. A shelf near the fireplace held a collection of books that was unexpected for a frontier rancher, a battered copy of Dickens, 2 volumes of Thoreau, a worn Bible that showed clear signs of actual use, a book on cattle breeds and rangeland management, and a collection of Shakespeare that had clearly been read multiple times. She found herself looking at those books and revising some assumption she had arrived with, though she could not have named exactly what assumption it was. He was also lonely. Not in the way that announced itself, but in the way that long solitude leaves marks on a person, the slight pause before he spoke, as if relearning the timing of conversation. The way he would occasionally start to say something at dinner and then stop himself, as though he had forgotten whether or not he was allowed to take up space in a shared conversation. 3 weeks in, she asked him directly, "How long were you alone out here before the fire?" He looked up from his book. "What makes you ask? You apologize before you speak," she said, Not out loud, but you do it. You check whether it is acceptable to say what you are thinking. He was quiet for a long moment. 2 years, he said finally. My ranch hand left to follow the cattle drives north. My nearest neighbor is 11 miles west. The fire happened in late August. I sent the advertisement in September. He paused. You are more observant than I expected. You expected not much, she said without heat. I expected a capable woman in a difficult circumstance looking for stable work, he said carefully, which is accurate. I did not expect someone who reads people the way you do. I was married to a man who hid things, Marcella said. You learn to read people when the alternative is being surprised. She had not meant to say that much. It came out before she could weigh it, and she felt the slight vulnerability of it, the exposure of letting him see a piece of the hidden architecture of her life. Bernard did not press. He did not ask follow-up questions. He simply absorbed it with the respectful quiet of someone who understood that people offer things at the pace they can afford to, and that pushing for more is a kind of theft. I am sorry that happened, he said finally. I managed, she said, and then, because that sounded more closed off than she meant, thank you. The October weather rolled in with spectacular violence. Kansas in the fall was nothing like Missouri in the fall. The wind had an authority to it, a sweeping horizontal force that bent the dry grasses flat and pushed straight through any wall that had a weakness in it. Marcella learned to bank the fires properly. She learned that the kitchen door needed to be latched with the extra bolt, or the wind would find it. She discovered that the provision of good wool stockings was not a comfort but a genuine necessity. Bernard came in one evening with ice in his beard and both hands wrapped in his kerchief, having spent 3 hours reinforcing a section of fence that the wind had worked loose, and Marcella had hot coffee and a plate of soup beans waiting without being asked, and the look on his face when he walked in and found it there was not gratitude exactly. It was something more complicated than gratitude. It was the look of a man who had not been waited for in a very long time and did not quite know what to do with the feeling that someone had noticed he was cold. The fence, she asked. Holding for now, he said, wrapping both hands around the coffee cup. Eli said the gray mare has been restless. Storm coming, Bernard said. She always knows before we do, better barometer than anything I have seen. Marcella had set up a system in the house that impressed even herself. She had reorganized the pantry, established a weekly baking schedule, mended the curtains that had been hanging in tatters, found a use for an old crate that became a useful shelf near the door for boots and outdoor gear, and had begun a kitchen garden in a protected spot near the south wall, though the planting season was long past for this year. The garden was for spring. She was thinking about spring already, which meant she was thinking past her original agreement, and she noticed this fact about herself with a wariness she did not fully examine. The storm that Persimmon had predicted arrived 2 days later with tremendous force, a 3-day prairie blizzard that locked all 4 of them, Marcella, Bernard, Eli, and an unexpected fourth in the form of Bernard's nearest neighbor, a man named Clarence Webb, who had ridden over just ahead of the storm's leading edge and gotten stranded inside the main house. Clarence Webb was 70 years old, deeply tanned, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an incident he described with cheerful vagueness as a disagreement with a rope, and more talkative than any person Marcella had met on the frontier so far. He also, she quickly discovered, knew Bernard Carson extremely well. Bernard fixed my roof last spring, Clarence announced at supper on the first storm night, gesturing with his spoon. Did not ask for anything, just showed up with lumber and a hammer. Man does that kind of thing and never says a word about it. Bernard looked at his soup beans with studied patience. Clarence. What? The woman ought to know who she is working for. Clarence looked at Marcella with clear and unsubtle interest. He talked to you about the river claim situation. No, Marcella said, looking at Bernard. Bernard set down his spoon. It is not relevant. It is entirely relevant, Clarence said comfortably. 2 years back, there was a man named Harlan Das who decided he had rights to the water access on Bernard's east section, filed a claim with the county land office that was fraudulent as the day is long, but fraudulent paperwork can cause a great deal of trouble for a person while it is being sorted. Bernard spent 18 months and a considerable amount of money getting that claim dismissed. That is part of why the ranch finances are what they are. Marcella looked at Bernard. Bernard met her eyes briefly and then looked back at his soup. "You were going to tell me," she said. "It was not quite a question." "At an appropriate time," he said. "The advertisement said the ranch was prosperous," she said. "Prosperous people do not usually have 18 months of legal fees depleting their resources." "No," he agreed, "they do not." "So the fire was not the only thing that hit you hard," she said. "No," he said again. "It was not." She thought about hidden things. She thought about what it was like to discover the architecture of someone else's difficulty, the real shape of it, different from the version they had presented. She thought about Thomas again, briefly, and then she put Thomas away because this was not Thomas. This was a man who, when pressed, told the truth. He held things back, yes, but he did not construct false pictures. He simply, and she was understanding this more fully now, had too much pride to display his difficulties plainly and not quite enough practice with trust to know how to begin. "The legal situation is resolved?" she asked. "Completely," Bernard said. "Das sold his claim and moved to Colorado 6 months ago." "Then we build forward," Marcella said, with a practicality that made Clarence Webb look at her with frank admiration and Bernard Carson look at her with something she was not ready to name. The blizzard kept them inside for 3 days, and those 3 days were among the more unusual of Marcella's life. The 4 of them ate together, played cards in the evenings. Clarence was a formidable whist player, and explained his strategies at great length whether or not anyone asked, and talked, really talked, in the way that confinement sometimes produces between people who might otherwise have kept polite distances. She learned that Bernard had come to Kansas from Virginia in 1869, when he was 24. She learned that he had chosen the frontier specifically because the frontier asked for what you could do and not for who your family had been, a consideration that, from the careful way he said it, carried considerable personal weight. She did not press on that. She stored it. She told him, carefully and in portions she chose, about Hannibal, about Thomas, the early years of their marriage when things had been straightforward, the gradual discovery of the gambling debts, the long illness, and the long process of watching someone she had loved become someone defined entirely by what they could not stop doing. She did not make Thomas into a villain. He had been a damaged man, not a cruel one, and she had loved him before the damage became everything. But she was honest about what it had cost her, the years and the money and the future she had believed she was building that had turned out to be built on sand. Bernard listened to all of it without trying to fix it or minimize it or rush past the difficult parts to the resolution. He listened the way people listen when they are genuinely there and not somewhere else in their heads, and Marcella found this both remarkable and quietly devastating, because she had not expected it and she had no armor prepared for it. On the second night of the blizzard, Eli fell asleep in his chair after supper, and Clarence Webb retired to the second bedroom with the philosophical ease of an old man who had long since stopped being embarrassed about needing sleep, and Marcella and Bernard sat by the fire alone for the first time since she had arrived at the Broken Spur. The wind outside was enormous and theatrical. Inside, the fire was steady and warm, and the room smelled of wood smoke and the dried herbs she had hung in the kitchen. Bernard was reading Dickens, she noticed, the same worn copy, and Marcella was doing mending on a set of curtains she had taken down from the hallway, and it was a scene of such ordinary domestic peace that she stopped and felt the strangeness of it, the complete contrast with what she had expected her life on the frontier to feel like. "You did not have to take on the boy," she said, without planning to say it. Bernard looked up. He had learned by now not to be startled when she spoke into silences. "Eli, he has no family. You gave him a place. You could have hired a grown man instead, someone with more experience. It would have been more practical. Bernard looked at his book for a moment without reading it. He showed up at the depot in August with no money and no plan, he said. I was there to pick up a supply shipment. He had hitchhiked from Wichita on the back of a freight wagon. A pause. I was 14 once and in worse circumstances than his. Virginia, Marcella said. Virginia, he confirmed. He did not elaborate immediately and she did not push. Then, after a long moment, my father's ranch. Not my father's willingness to keep me on it after I turned 16. Another pause. I know what it is to be useful enough to stay but not wanted enough to matter. I did not want that for him. The fire snapped and settled. Somewhere in the walls the wind found a whistle of a gap. Marcella set down her mending and looked at Bernard Carson, at the clean line of his jaw and the steadiness of his hands and the careful private way he had of saying enormous things in small words. You are a complicated man, she said. I have been told I am a difficult one, he said. Those are different things, she said. Difficult suggests obstruction. Complicated suggests depth. She picked up her mending again. I do not mind depth. He looked at her for a moment longer than he usually let himself, and then he looked back at his book, and neither of them said anything else, and the fire burned down, and eventually she said good night and went to her room, and she lay in the dark with the blizzard screaming outside and thought, with a clarity that was both inconvenient and honest, that she was in significant danger of caring about Bernard Carson in a way that was entirely outside the terms of a housekeeper's arrangement. When the blizzard broke on the third morning and Clarence Webb saddled his horse and headed back to his 11 miles west ranch, the broken spur felt different. Not changed, exactly, but clarified. As if the storm had blown some obscuring layer away and left the actual shapes of things more visible. November moved through with a cold efficiency, and December arrived and brought with it the particular quality of frontier winter. Not the wet, heavy cold of Missouri, but a dry, brittle cold that cracked lips and made the air taste like metal. Marcella ordered seeds from the mail order catalog for spring planting. She asked Bernard about the kitchen garden placement, and he walked out with her in the cold to look at the sun angles and the drainage situation. And they stood outside together in their coats, and their breath made clouds, and he pointed out where the soil was best, and she made notes in the small journal she carried. And at one point, he leaned in to see what she was writing, and he was close enough that she could smell pine resin and clean wool and something specifically him. And she wrote a perfectly ordinary word in her journal without looking up, keeping her expression neutral through what she privately considered a significant act of willpower. Christmas came, and she had not been told whether the broken spur observed Christmas, and so she simply observed it herself, making ginger biscuits, a recipe she had by memory from her grandmother, and setting them on the table on Christmas morning alongside a pot of especially good coffee. Eli came down and went still with a kind of hoping not to want too much quality that she recognized from her own younger years. Bernard came in from the early barn check and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table and then at her. And the thing in his expression was the kind of thing that could not be argued with. We observe Christmas, he said, as if resolving a question he had been holding. She had made small gifts, a new pair of knitted gloves for Eli, because his current ones had holes, a bookmark made from a ribbon she had brought from Missouri for Bernard, with a pressed wildflower from the fall tucked against the ribbon before she sewed it closed. She had found the wildflower in September, in the first days at the ranch, a small bright thing she had pressed between the pages of her notebook without knowing why. Bernard held the bookmark for a long moment without saying anything. Then he opened his Dickens to the page he was on and placed it there, and closed the book, and looked at her with an openness that lasted only a second before he organized his face back into its habitual steadiness. "Thank you," he said. "The gloves have a third finger that is slightly too long," she told Eli, because she needed somewhere to put her attention. "I will correct it after breakfast." January was the season's test. A sick calf meant Bernard and Eli were up 3 nights running. Marcella kept the night fires banked and had food ready at whatever hour someone staggered in from the barn. And on the third night, the calf pulled through, and Bernard came in at 2 in the morning looking like a man who had been wrung out and left to dry. And she gave him hot coffee and a plate of whatever she could put together from the pantry. And he sat at the table with his hands wrapped around the cup and said, "I would not have managed this winter without you here." And it was so plain and direct and stripped of any artifice that she did not know what to do with it except to sit down across from him and say, equally plain, "I am glad I am here." They looked at each other across the table in the 2 in the morning silence, the fire talking softly in the other room, and something shifted between them that was like a foundation settling, not dramatic, not sudden, but permanent. Something that was not going to unsettle. She had said she would stay through spring. She had not revisited that deadline aloud. But in January she received a letter from her sister in Hannibal, asking how things were, and she wrote back a careful letter that described the ranch, described the frontier, described the brutal honesty of the work in the landscape, and somehow said almost nothing that was actually about those things, and quite a lot about the way the stars looked different here, about the gray mare's opinions, about a man who read Dickens by firelight and held things back not out of dishonesty, but out of a profound and private dignity. She read the letter over before she sealed it. She sealed it anyway. February brought the kind of days that made you understand why people who did not belong on the frontier went back to wherever they had come from. Relentless cold, monotone gray sky, the sameness of the frozen landscape becoming a test of interior resources. Marcella discovered she had more of those resources than she had known. She also discovered that her interior resources improved significantly in the presence of a particular kind of shared silence. The kind that existed in the evenings when Bernard was at the table with his books, and she was at her mending or her letters, and the fire was going, and nothing needed to be said because nothing needed to be said, and the ease of that felt like something she was being offered without quite being told what to call it. She made a different kind of mending mistake than the glove in February. She was hemming a pair of work trousers Bernard had torn on a fence, and she did it wrong the first time and had to take it out and redo it, and he caught her at it and said she did not need to mend his clothing, that was not part of their arrangement, and she said she was aware of that and kept mending, and he sat down across the table and watched her for a moment and said, "Marcella." She looked up. "I need to say something," he said. She put down the trousers. She had learned by now that when Bernard decided to say something directly, it was worth setting down what you were doing. "The spring deadline," he said. "I am not going to ask you to stay. I want to be clear about that. Whatever you decide should be a free decision with no pressure from me." He paused, visibly working through what he was trying to say. "But I want you to know that what you have given this ranch, what you have given this household is not something that can be replaced by a different arrangement. And I want you to know that it is not only the work." He stopped again. "I am explaining this badly." "You are explaining it fine," she said quietly. "I am trying to say that you matter here," he said. "Not your labor, you. And I did not expect that, and I am not sure what to do with it, but I thought you should know it existed." Marcella Dugan looked at this man who had lied to get her here, and told her the truth the moment she arrived, who had given a homeless boy a place on principle, who read Shakespeare and mended fences in blizzards, and held his loneliness with a quiet dignity that was almost painful to witness. And she thought about the $14.30 that had felt like the whole sum of her options just 5 months ago, and she thought about how much had changed since then. Not in her circumstances exactly, but in the landscape of what she thought was possible for herself. "I am not going in the spring," she said. He went very still. "I decided in January," she said. "I am not going anywhere." The thing that moved across his face then was not triumph or satisfaction. It was relief, the deep kind, the kind that comes from something you have been bracing against not hitting you after all. He exhaled slowly, and his hands on the table opened from where they had been tightly closed, and he said, "Good. in a voice that was too quiet to be casual. "Good," she agreed. They sat there for a moment with the word between them, and then she picked up the trousers and kept mending, and he sat across from her, and neither of them said anything else because it did not need anything else. March brought the first warmth and the first mud, and with the mud came the first sign that the broken spur was genuinely turning around. The breeding stock had wintered well. Bernard secured a contract to supply beef to the army fort 20 miles south, a negotiation he had ridden into Dodge City to complete, and he came back with the contract in his coat pocket and a restrained but visible satisfaction that Marcella found more attractive than any extravagant display of success would have been. She also had her first real conflict with Dodge City in March. She had ridden in with Bernard to pick up supplies, only the second time she had made the trip since arriving. Dodge City in 1876 was a town in full frontier operation. The Long Branch Saloon, the cattle pens, the front street establishments that catered to every kind of frontier appetite, the mix of cowboys and merchants and gamblers and lawmen that made it simultaneously vibrant and volatile. She had gotten separated from Bernard at the general store and found herself at the dry goods counter dealing with the proprietor's wife, a woman named Mrs. Hargreave, who was polite in the brittle specific way of someone holding a question they have decided is inappropriate to ask directly. "You are with Bernard Carson," Mrs. Hargreave said, while wrapping Marcella's fabric purchase. "I work at the Broken Spur," Marcella said. Mrs. Hargreave wrapped the package with a precision that communicated volumes. "I see," she said. "And what exactly is the nature of that arrangement?" Marcella looked at this woman, who was not asking out of malice exactly, but out of the specific social policing function that frontier towns depended on to maintain their particular version of order. She understood the question perfectly. She had lived inside versions of that question her whole adult life. "The nature of the arrangement," Marcella said, with a pleasantness that had considerable steel underneath it, "is that I manage the domestic operations of the ranch and am compensated accordingly. The same way a housekeeper has always worked anywhere in this country." She took her package. "Good day, Mrs. Hargreave." She was at the door when Mrs. Hargreave said, not quite under her breath, "It is a long way to come for housekeeping." Marcella turned around. "I came because I needed work and the frontier needed people," she said clearly. "That is what the frontier has always been for. If you have a different theory, I suggest you keep it to yourself." She was outside and across the street before her hands stopped shaking, not from fear, from the particular anger of someone who has spent years being the subject of other people's assessments and is very tired of it. Bernard found her 10 minutes later at the wagon. He read her face with the accuracy she was still getting used to, the way he could see what she was feeling without her having to annotate it, and he said, "What happened?" She told him, briefly and precisely. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, Mrs. Hargreave's husband owes me for $20 of fence posts he has not paid for in 8 months. I have never pressed it because it seemed unkind." Another pause. "Perhaps I have been too diplomatic," Marcella almost laughed. "Do not collect a debt on my behalf," she said. "That would not help." "No," he agreed. "What would help?" She thought about it honestly. "Nothing from the outside," she said. "I know what I am. I know what my arrangement is. I know what my character is. What other people make of it in their own heads is their responsibility, not mine." He looked at her with that expression she had come to recognize, the one that was not easy to look at because it contained too much that was real. "You are remarkable," he said. "I am practical," she said. "Load the grain sacks and let us go home." Home. She had said it without thinking, and they both heard it, and Bernard lifted the grain sacks with particular care, as if he needed something physical to do with the feeling the word had made. April was extraordinary. The Kansas spring was nothing like she had expected, not the gentle graduated greening of Missouri, but an explosion, as if the land had been holding everything back through the brutal winter and was now releasing it all at once. The grasses came in thick and vivid. Wildflowers showed up overnight in swaths of color. that she could see from the kitchen window while she was making bread in the mornings. The cattle, which had been lean and cautious, began to fill out and move with the easy confidence of animals that had enough to eat. The first calves came, 8 of them over 3 weeks, healthy and strong. Marcella planted her kitchen garden. She had seeds for tomatoes, green beans, beets, squash, and an optimistic assortment of herbs. She planted them herself, on her knees in the south-facing patch she and Bernard had chosen, working the soil with the hand tools from the barn. And Bernard came by at one point and looked at the layout with genuine interest and suggested a modification to the squash placement based on how the afternoon shadow fell from the house, and she incorporated his suggestion. And they were crouching together in the garden looking at her planting sketch when his hand covered hers to point something out, and neither of them moved for a moment, just stayed there, his large warm hand over hers on the paper. And then he pulled back and stood up, and she stood up too, and they did not look directly at each other for the next half hour. But the next morning he had built her a proper raised bed frame from spare lumber, sited exactly where the sketch said, and set it before she woke up, and she stood at her room's outside door looking at it in the early light with a feeling in her chest that had no practical name. May was when things almost fell apart. A man rode into the Broken Spur on a Tuesday morning in mid-May, and from the kitchen window Marcella saw Bernard's body language change the moment he recognized the rider. She was not close enough to see faces, but she could see the way Bernard went still and then very deliberately set down what he had been doing and walked forward to meet the man at the gate. She learned at supper that the man was Harlan Doss, not in Colorado after all, apparently. Back in Kansas, and with a new claim, not on Bernard's water rights this time, but on a disputed boundary section that touched the south pasture. Doss had apparently found a surveyor willing to file an amended plat that moved the boundary line 50 yards in his favor. It was not the water rights fraud exactly, because the surveyor's plat had the appearance of legitimacy. It was the kind of sustained, methodical harassment of a specific person that went beyond ordinary property dispute into something darker, the portrait of a man who had developed a personal mission out of what had begun as opportunism. Bernard told this with his customary flatness, reporting facts, but she could see the cost of it in the set of his jaw and the way he kept refilling his coffee cup without drinking it. "Why you specifically?" Marcella asked. "I was the one who reported his original fraudulent claim to the county land office," Bernard said. "I had evidence. Other ranchers were affected too, but I was the one who compiled the documentation and made the case." He did not appreciate that. "So this is retaliation," she said. "This is retaliation that has a legal surface on it," he said, "which makes it more dangerous than simple retaliation." "What are you going to do?" "I am going to Dodge City tomorrow to find a lawyer," he said, "and I am going to start documenting everything I know about Doss's pattern of activity." He paused. "It may take time." "I can help," Marcella said. He looked at her. "I can write clearly and I can organize documents," she said. "I spent 7 years managing Thomas's business correspondence when he was ill. I know how to present a case in writing. Let me help you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw him consider refusing on principle, the pride again, the reluctance to show his difficulties, and she watched him override it with something that was becoming more available to him than it had been in September. "All right," he said. They worked on it together through May, evenings at the kitchen table, Marcella organizing and writing and Bernard supplying memory and detail. She was good at it, better than he had expected, and she could see him noticing this, revising some internal picture of what she was capable of in the way he had been slowly revising it since September. She had not come here as a woman looking to prove herself. She had come here to survive. But the proving was happening anyway, and she found she did not mind it, because it was happening in the presence of someone who was paying honest attention and not cataloging it as a performance. The lawyer Bernard found, a man named Silas Prout, operating out of Dodge City with a reputation for frontier land cases, reviewed what they had compiled and was quietly impressed. He said the new survey plat was weak, and that the pattern of Doss's activity was provable as harassment if they could get depositions from the other ranchers who had been affected the first time. Bernard had those connections. He spent 2 weekends riding out to collect signed statements. Harlan Doss did not give up easily. In June, he had 2 men from his operation tear down a section of fence on the disputed boundary, which constituted criminal damage and gave Pruitt the physical evidence he needed to file an injunction. The injunction was granted. The case went to the county circuit court in July. On the morning, the circuit court ruled in Bernard's favor complete dismissal of the survey claim, plus damages for the fence destruction. Marcella was in the garden when she heard his horse coming back down the road, and she stood up and shaded her eyes and could tell from 100 yards away, from the way he was sitting in the saddle, that it had gone right. He came through the gate and swung down, and she was walking toward him, and he was walking toward her, and he said, "It is over." And she said, "I know," because she had known from his face, and without planning it or measuring it, she walked directly into the open space his arms had made, and he held her, properly held her, both arms around her and her face against his shoulder and his cheek against her hair, and it lasted long enough to mean something and not quite long enough. And when she stepped back, his eyes were darker than usual, and his hands had not entirely let go of her. "Marcella," he said. "Not yet," she said, because she needed a moment to be sure about what she was sure about. He nodded. He let her go. He had infinite patience when he chose to use it. She went to bed that night certain about what she was sure about and lay awake for an hour considering what she was going to do about it and how she was going to do it. The frontier had taught her to be direct, to not waste time on the elaborate indirections that social convention usually demanded, because the frontier did not support that kind of inefficiency. You needed to know what you were working with. You needed to say what was true. She went to find him in the morning while the day was still new, before Eli was up. He was at the barn, and she stood in the barn doorway in the early light and said his name, and he turned, and she said, with the same plainness he had always offered her, "I love you. I want to be clear about that before we go any further with anything else." Bernard Carson was a man who was careful with words, who measured them before he used them, who held things back out of a pride and a privacy that were part of his fundamental nature. He crossed the barn in 4 steps and cupped her face in both his hands and said, "Marcella Dugan, I have been in love with you since you walked off that train and told me to my face that I had lied to you and then stayed anyway." And then he kissed her, and it was not tentative or careful or measured. It was everything he had been holding back since September, and she kissed him back the same way. Eli found them still in the barn 20 minutes later and retreated immediately to the house with a diplomacy that was entirely unpracticed but entirely correct, and he was whistling when he left, which was not something he typically did in the mornings, and it was so transparently delighted that Marcella started laughing against Bernard's shoulder. "He knew," she said. "He knew before I did," Bernard said. "He told me in January that I was being a fool." "Good for Eli," she said. The summer was different from everything before it. The ranch was building momentum. The Army supply contract renewed. The calf crop was strong. A new hand named Ruben Martinez joined them in August. A steady, experienced man from Texas who knew cattle inside and out, and whose presence meant Bernard was no longer running the operation on 2 people's labor. The kitchen garden produced with such abundance that Marcella was putting up preserves and had enough surplus vegetables to trade at the general store, which Mrs. Hargreave accepted with a professionalism that suggested she had revised her earlier position, or at least was willing to set it aside in the face of excellent tomatoes. They were easy together in the way that people are when they have been through real difficulty together and come out the other side still choosing each other. They argued occasionally about ranch finances, because Marcella had opinions about record-keeping and Bernard's prior system had been informal at best. about the timing of the winter supply run, about whether the gray mare needed a proper stall or could continue to dictate her own terms in the pasture. They argued directly and resolved things directly, and the resolution always left things cleaner than before, and neither of them carried arguments forward the way she had learned arguments could be carried, like debts, compounding. He courted her properly through the summer, in the way that frontier courtship looked small things, intentional things. The way he started picking up whatever book she was currently reading and leaving it on the arm of her chair. The way he began asking her opinion on ranch decisions he had previously made alone, not because he could not decide, but because he wanted to know what she thought. A small carved wooden box he made in the evenings in the barn and set on her windowsill one morning, no note, just the box, made from scraps of the lumber he had used to rebuild after the fire. She put her grandmother's ring in it, the only jewelry she had brought from Missouri. In September, exactly 1 year after she had stepped off that train into the dust and dark of the Dodge City Depot, Bernard asked her to marry him. He did it after supper, in the kitchen, with Eli conspicuously absent, having announced well in advance his intention to take Persimmon on an extended evening ride, which meant the horse's opinions about Eli had significantly improved over the year, a development Marcella considered a metaphor for something. Bernard had not done anything elaborate. He had set the table nicely, and there was good coffee, and after supper he reached across the table and put a ring down in front of her, a simple gold band, modest and right, purchased in Dodge City from the jeweler on Front Street. "I know what you left behind in Missouri," he said. "I know you came here with nothing you wanted and found something worth keeping despite it. I'm asking you to make it permanent." A pause. "I am asking you to stay, Marcella, not for the ranch, for me." She looked at the ring. She looked at him, this complicated, difficult, honest man with his books and his long silences and his extraordinary capacity for quiet loyalty, who had lied to get her here and spent a year proving that the truth was worth far more. "Yes," she said. She put the ring on herself, which he seemed to find both completely expected and deeply characteristic of her, and then she reached across the table and took his hand, and he held it with both of his. And they sat there in the kitchen of the Broken Spur with the fire going and the prairie night coming down outside, and the extraordinary, ordinary reality of two people who had found each other at the end of a lie that turned into something true. Eli came back from his ride and stood in the doorway and looked at them holding hands across the table and said, with 14-year-old dignity, "It is about time." And Bernard told him to go wash up for bed, and Marcella was laughing again, and Eli was grinning as he went. They were married in October of 1876 in Dodge City at the small community church on the east side of town. Silas Prout and Clarence Webb served as witnesses. Ruben Martinez wore his best shirt, and his expression was serious, with the sincerity of someone attending something important. Eli Rourke stood straight and held the ring box at the appropriate moment and was, despite himself, visibly moved in the way that young people are moved by real things when they encounter them. Mrs. Hargreave from the dry goods store came. Marcella had not expected that. Mrs. Hargreave gave her a length of very fine cotton from her own stock, folded and tied with a ribbon, and said, with a stiffness that was the closest she was capable of coming to an apology, "The territory is glad for people of your character, Mrs. Carson." Marcella accepted this with a graciousness that was genuine, because she had never needed Mrs. Hargreave's approval, which made it possible to appreciate the gesture without depending on it. The ceremony was brief and direct, as frontier ceremonies were. Bernard said his vows with a steadiness that was entirely him, looking at her the whole time, not at the minister, not at his hands, at her. She said hers, looking back at him with the same directness. When the minister pronounced them married, Bernard kissed her in a way that was restrained enough for a church and still communicated everything. And Clarence Webb said, "Finally," from the front pew, and the small assembly laughed. The winter of 1876 into 1877 was their first winter as a married couple, and the ranch had changed sufficiently from the previous year that it felt different, not just in her own standing, but in the physical reality of the place. The new outbuilding that had been in partial reconstruction since summer was finished before the first hard frost. Reuben had winterized the barn properly. The larder was full. The 15 cattle of the previous year had become 23, healthy animals with good winter cover. Marcella was carrying their first child by December, confirmed by the doctor in Dodge City on a supply run, and she came home and told Bernard in the kitchen while he was at the stove, and he turned around and looked at her with an expression that moved through 3 or 4 different feelings in about 2 seconds before landing on something that was mostly wonder. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I'm just also expecting a child." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her and put both hands on her face with the same gesture he had used the morning in the barn when they had finally said the things they had been circling for months, careful and complete, holding something very precious. "I am going to be a father," he said, as if confirming the reality of it. "You are going to be an excellent one," she said. He kissed her forehead. Then he had to go back to the stove because something was burning, and she laughed. And the kitchen smelled like scorched onions, and the fire was going, and outside the Kansas sky was doing something spectacular with the late afternoon light. Eli, who was 15 now and growing at an alarming rate, received the news with a complicated expression that eventually sorted itself into a grin. "I am going to be an older brother," he said. "You are going to be the best one," Bernard said, "because you have practice at being reliable." Eli's ears went red. He went to check on the horses. Reuben Martinez received the news with a formal handshake for Bernard and a respectful nod for Marcella, and the kind of genuine warmth that surfaces in people who have spent enough time with a situation to be invested in its outcomes. The spring of 1877 brought the baby, a boy, born in April on a warm day with the first wildflowers already showing outside the bedroom window. They named him James, after no particular person, simply because it was right for him. Bernard held his son in the barn doorway at one point in the first week, both of them looking out at the ranch, the repaired outbuildings, the solid barn, the pasture full of healthy cattle, the kitchen garden Marcella was already planning for its 3rd season, the gray mare demonstrating her opinions about something at the far fence, and the full span of what had been rebuilt from the ashes in every sense was visible and complete. Eli turned 16 that summer and asked to be taught to handle the accounts with Bernard, a request that was so practical and forward-thinking that Bernard immediately agreed. Eli was good with numbers, better than either of them had realized, and by the end of the summer, he had a genuine working grasp of the ranch's financial system, which Marcella had long since reorganized into something legible and replicable. She had the quiet satisfaction of seeing a system she had built functioning past her own direct involvement in it. Bernard and Reuben brought on a second ranch hand in the fall of 1877, a man named Peter Cole, which meant the Broken Spur was staffed at a level that reflected real growth rather than bare survival. The Army supply contract renewed for a 3rd year. Bernard began looking at the possibility of expanding the herd. Marcella wrote to her sister in Hannibal and described all of this, including James, who was by that point 4 months old and had his father's dark hair and his mother's tendency to look at everything with concentrated assessment. Her sister wrote back and said she was coming to visit in the spring, which was news that Marcella received with more uncomplicated happiness than she had expected to feel, given how thoroughly she had separated herself from Missouri in her own mind. When she told Bernard, he said, "Good," and began planning where the guest accommodation could be expanded, because that was what he did with things that mattered. He built something. The spring of 1878 brought her sister Clara to the Broken Spur for 3 weeks, and Clara Dugan, now Clara Marsh, married to a river merchant, stood in the kitchen of the main house and looked at her younger sister, who had come out here with nothing, expecting nothing, and said, "You are entirely yourself here," with the tone of someone stating something that should have been predictable but somehow turned out to be a revelation. "I am," Marcella said. She was nursing James at the kitchen table while simultaneously reviewing the seed order for the summer garden, which she accepted was a chaotic image and did not apologize for. "He is a good man," Clara said, meaning Bernard. "He is a complicated one," Marcella said, which was what she always said and which always meant yes. Clara met Eli, now 16 and nearly as tall as Bernard, who was by this point so integrated into the rhythm and identity of the Broken Spur that he was simply part of the family in every sense that mattered. Clara met Reuben and Peter. She went out and met Persimmon, who had no opinions about Clara, which meant the gray mare's selectivity was still specifically about Eli. And Eli had by now arrived at a peaceable negotiated relationship with the horse that involved a particular sequence of apple pieces and a very specific approach from the left. He had documented this procedure with the precision of a military manual, which Bernard had hung on the barn wall as a genuine reference document. Clara went back to Missouri with the kind of stories that become family legend. The summer of 1878 was the best the Broken Spur had seen since Bernard had first come to this land. The herd was at 38 head. The Army contract was secure. The ranch had a reputation in the county for quality beef and for reliability, two things that Bernard Carson had built back from nearly nothing with the same methodical determination he applied to everything. Silas Prout, who had become a genuine friend, told them over dinner one evening that Harlan Das had moved to New Mexico territory and had not been heard from since, and the news settled the last small alert that had been living in the back of Marcella's awareness since the previous year. She was expecting again by fall. They had suspected by October and confirmed by November, and this time Bernard was ready for the announcement in a way that was different from the first time, not less moved, but more prepared, more settled into the reality of himself as a father and as a partner in something ongoing and generative. "James will be pleased," Marcella said. "James will be primarily occupied with his own concerns," Bernard said, with the dry accuracy of someone who had spent a year and a half in close observation of their small son's personality, which was expansive and determined, and had inherited the best and most challenging traits of both his parents. "But eventually, he will find a sibling useful." Their daughter arrived in June of 1879, born on a warm morning with a thunderstorm building in the west and the smell of rain already on the air. They named her Ruth. She had Marcella's eyes and Bernard's stubborn jaw, and she was, from her very first hours, a person with a strong sense of her own preferences, which both her parents regarded as entirely appropriate. Eli, who was 17 by now, and had been handling an increasingly substantial portion of the ranch's bookkeeping and supply management, held Ruth for the first time with the solemn care of someone being trusted with something irreplaceable, and looked up at Marcella and said, "She is going to cause problems." "She is going to solve them," Marcella said, with the comfortable certainty of a woman who had been underestimated before and had opinions about the projections people placed on girls. Eli considered this. "Also true," he said, "both things at once." "Now you are thinking clearly," Bernard said. The year 1879 moved toward its end with the particular feeling of something that has found its shape. The Broken Spur was not just a functional ranch anymore. It was a working, growing enterprise with 2 employees, a structured accounts system, a reputation in the county, and a household that was genuinely alive in a way that empty buildings never are, full of people who had chosen to be there, who had reasons to stay and reasons to care, and who had built those reasons out of difficult circumstances over years of honest work and honest feeling. Marcella had not come to the frontier expecting any of this. She had come expecting nothing, nothing good, nothing lasting, nothing that would change the fundamental direction of a life that had been pointing toward diminishment since the day she had started counting Thomas's debts and realized the number would never go down. She had come expecting hard work and hard weather and the occasional grace of solitude. She had packed the expectations very small on purpose because small expectations were the only ones that could not be destroyed. What she had gotten instead was everything, not all at once, not simply, not without the particular costs that the frontier extracted from everyone who tried to build something on it, the winters that tested endurance to its actual limits, the legal battles that cost money and time that could never be reclaimed, the physical exhaustion of work that did not stop because you were tired, the loneliness of distance, and the specific ache of building from very little. She had paid those costs. Bernard had paid them far longer. But what had come through on the other side of the paying was real. On a November evening in 1879, with James asleep in his room and Ruth asleep in her cradle by the fireplace, Bernard and Marcella sat at the kitchen table together, the way they had sat hundreds of times since the night she had arrived on that last train with her anger and her $14.30. The Dickens was on his side of the table. Her seed catalog for the coming spring was on hers. Coffee was going on the stove. He looked up from his book and looked at her across the table, and the look had in it everything that had accumulated between them. The betrayal she had forgiven because it was immediately and honestly admitted. The winter nights and the blizzard and the legal fights and the ginger biscuits on Christmas morning and the morning in the barn when they had both finally stopped being careful and said the things they meant. The wedding in October light and the children and the rebuilt ranch and the gray mare's opinions and the 3 years of building something from near nothing into something full and real and theirs. What are you thinking? He asked, which was a question he had learned to ask because she thought in layers and he had found over 3 years that asking opened things worth hearing. She considered the question honestly, the way she always did. I am thinking that I came here expecting nothing, she said, and you gave me everything anyway. He was quiet for a moment. I lied to get you here, he said. You did, she agreed. And then you stayed. And then I stayed. She looked at him across the table, across the lamplight, across all the accumulated weight of what they had built together in this place that had been half burned when she arrived and was now fully alive. I have been thinking about the garden for next spring. I want to try melons. Clarence said the south side of his land gets them well. Clarence will give you every opinion he has ever had about melons, Bernard said, in great detail. I know, she said. I am looking forward to it. He smiled. It was not a smile he used often, the full one, the one that changed his whole face from its habitual careful steadiness to something open and unguarded and entirely honest. She had learned in 3 years of living with Bernard Carson that this smile was given sparingly. But when it appeared, it was the real thing, the realist version of a man who had learned the hard way that real things were the only ones worth having. She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they stayed that way while the fire talked and the Kansas night came down outside. And in the cradle by the fireplace, Ruth made a small sound in her sleep. And in the other room James was thoroughly and peacefully unconscious, and the broken spur stood solid around them, rebuilt and repaired and permanent, and out in the pasture Persimmon was probably having opinions about something in the dark. And somewhere 11 miles west Clarence Webb was undoubtedly asleep mid-sentence, and the stars over the frontier were the same enormous, impossible profusion they had been on the first night she had ridden this road and tilted her head back to. Look at them, furious and uncertain, and still capable of finding them beautiful. She had come to the frontier expecting nothing. She had arrived at a half-burned ranch in the dark, angry at a man who had lied to her, with $14.30 and nowhere else to go, and she had made the most pragmatic decision of her adult life in a train depot in Dodge City, Kansas, and had walked into this story without knowing it was a story, thinking she was just surviving. Bernard Carson had given her a place to survive, and then he had given her more than that, a purpose, a partnership, a child, a daughter, a home that was genuinely hers, and the extraordinary particular gift of being known by someone who paid honest attention and held what he found there with care. She had not expected any of it. She had gotten all of it anyway. Outside, the wind moved across the Kansas plains with its ancient authority, bending the dry winter grasses flat, sweeping the enormous sky clean and cold, carrying the sounds of the frontier cattle and distance, and the infinite patient silence of land that does not owe anything to anyone, but takes care of those who learn to understand it. Inside the broken spur, the fire was steady and warm, and the coffee was going on the stove, and Marcella Dugan Carson held her husband's hand across the kitchen table and thought about melons for the spring garden and did not try to count the ways her life had exceeded what she had allowed herself to want, because some things are better held than measured. The lamp burned low, and they stayed, and the ranch breathed around them, alive and solid and wholly theirs.